Bonjour à tous, bienvenue à la troisième édition des entrevues Code Vie. Welcome to the Code Life Interviews Part 3 of our series of panels celebrating the Montreal General Hospital's 200th anniversary. And with our panel today, we're going to be exploring the MGH's role as a teaching hospital over the years. And it's a tradition that we know began 200 years ago when its founding physicians established the Montreal Medical Institution, which offered bedside teaching and traditional lectures. It was a model that was important for Europe, of course, and in 1829, it became McGill University's founding faculty, the very first faculty of medicine in the country, in Canada. Alors, des générations de médecins formés à McGill qui ont participé à l'hôpital général de Montréal, qui ont pratiqué là plutôt, ont donc contribué à transformer la médecine et la tradition se poursuit aujourd'hui, entre autres avec nos distingués invités, our legendary guests. Dr. Leanne Feldman is the chair of the McGill Department of Surgery and surgeon-in-chief at the McGill University Health Center. We have Dr. Phil Gould with us, who has been the chairman of the Department of Medicine at McGill, physician-in-chief at the Montreal General Hospital, among many other titles. It's always difficult cutting down your titles a little bit. And Dr. Gould's early research led to the development of the CEA blood test, which is still the most frequently used test in the diagnosis and management of patients with cancer. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about that, of course, today. And Dr. Geneviève Genet, elle est la fondatrice de la première clinique d'immunologie de la reproduction au Canada, toujours la seule, une référence aujourd'hui, et qui se trouve à l'hôpital général de Montréal. So first of all, let's start with you, Dr. Feldman. We're just saying 2 years now as a surgeon-in-chief, and we know that one of the MGH's missions and one of its focuses is really improving the whole experience for patients when they're dealing with surgery, better preparation, better outcomes as well afterwards, better rehabilitation. And let me ask you, what does it mean for patients to be treated in a teaching hospital? How does it benefit them to be treated at the MGH?
I think it's a really enormous benefit to be treated at a teaching hospital where we can attract the best students who really help us in so many ways take care of the patients. And also, you know, as a teacher, you're teaching, but you're also learning from your students and your research students who are bringing innovative, new ideas to the bedside all the time, and also questioning, so you're always questioning what you're doing and trying to improve it. And the focus for us in the Department of Surgery at the MUHC and at the MGH is really integrating care for patients having surgery, really trying to prepare them as best as possible, making sure they know everything about what's going to happen to them, even providing innovative care in preparing patients for surgery with what we call prehabilitation. And those kinds of things are all part of research programs, so we can give patients really innovative care and then really tweak it, continue to improve, because we have the ability to understand exactly what we're doing through those research programs.
And are there, you know, any examples in your experience over the past few years of those tweaks that you've been able to make, those innovations that you've been able to apply because you're a teaching institution, you're a research institution as well, and that you're able to deliver rapidly to the patients?
Well, I think we like to think that we're very on top of the newest evidence, and part of our programs in integrating care is the ability to really translate those newest techniques and newest innovations in taking care of patients, taking them from keeping really up to date and bringing them really to the bedside. And really our students are a big part of that. They keep us up to date, they keep us on our toes, and we also can attract, when we have a place like the MGH, a world-class institution that's doing research, that attracts a kind of student, residents, fellows, who want to train with world-class people. They come from all over the world to train with people that they've heard speak at conferences, they've read their papers, and they come specifically to seek them out. Like you mentioned, people, the MGH was based on training models from Europe, and now we have people coming from Europe, all over the world, to train with some of our surgeons at the MGH.
Mm-hmm. And one of those MGH and MUHC legends is Dr. Phil Gould. You know, you've really had an outstanding career. and researcher and professor. We're going to get a little bit to your role as a mentor as well, because that's one you're quite well known for as well, on top of your medical discoveries. But tell us a little bit about what made you famous, right? Your big medical discovery. I know. Well, but tell us a little bit about that, how you came, how that came about.
I'd been on the ward for a year in internal medicine as a resident, and we saw a lot of patients with cancer, and that I found troubling. The therapies, which are so much better now than they were, but at that time they were rather non-specific. And the hope was to find something that was specific to cancer that could be attacked. And we knew at the beginning we were looking for a needle in the haystack. So if you do that, first get rid of the haystack. And effectively, that's what we did, using a couple of techniques. And only because, again, as Leanne has been saying, at a teaching hospital like the Montreal General, you have colleagues who will support you in doing that. It was a crazy idea, but we had the support. And at the end of the day, we wound up with the ability to actually find this molecule, to trace it in the blood, to use it in diagnosis, but primarily in following patients who've had surgery. Do they require therapy further to exactly? And so at the end of the day, again, the teaching hospital allows for that environment. Mm-hmm. And I'm forever grateful for it.
And when you made that discovery, we're going back almost 55, 60 years now. You know better than me. But did you know that how significant it would be when you made it? Bring us back.
We published it a couple of papers in a very good journal at one point in time. And the response was silence, because as it's been demonstrated repeatedly, significant findings in cancer research in particular are, in 85% of cases, not reproducible. And so one year, the biggest part of our budget was shipping serum to the US, to Canada, to Europe, to Japan, and having our colleagues try it. And then the results started coming back. One guy, a very good fellow in Boston, wrote back and said, "My God, it's true." And from then on, it snowballed from there. The hospital sold the procedure to Hoffmann-La Roche. I'm not going to go into what to do with the finances. That's another thing, unfortunately. But all that said, it became an international phenomenon. Life has been fun, to say the least.
And you were touching on that a little bit, the environment, finding the needle in the haystack, the ability to think a little bit differently outside the box within a teaching hospital. How was it fertile ground?
At the end of the day, we needed a lot of specimens from a lot of people in a particular fashion. And you have pathologists who will support you and say, we'll give you the tissue when you need it. We'll take what we need, give you the rest. Nurses in the operating room saying, don't put that in formalin, he needs it, okay? And get that in. And surgeons who will say, we'll support you in this. We got 10,000 specimens from the operating room, mm-hmm. which was a remarkable phenomenon. And it's not something you could do in a community hospital. So I again, just so grateful for my colleagues in the place and the culture in the institution. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, so many people have been able to benefit thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of patients across all over the world. So, Dr. Genet, en me dirigeant vers vous en français, on va faire la transition vers un petit peu de français aussi. Parlez-moi un petit peu de votre clinique d'immunologie reproductive. Comment ça a été inspiré aussi de votre travail avec... Parce que là, je vois qu'il y a quand même une grande complicité, tout le monde se connaît, mais en particulier, Dr. Gold est un peu un mentor pour vous, là. Fait que comment ça s'est venu l'idée de commencer la clinique?
Bien, en fait, ça s'est fait quand même assez rapidement, je vous dirais. Je pense que je commençais ma résidence en surspécialité, je pense le 2e mois de ma formation. Et puis, on a vu une patiente en clinique d'immunologie pour 10 fausses couches en 5 ans. J'étais un peu... je comprenais pas trop pourquoi elle venait en clinique pour voir un immunologue. Et puis là, je vais voir Dr. Gold. J'ai dit, bien, on a reçu cette consultation-là. Je pense pas qu'on est capable d'aider cette patiente-là. Et Dr. Gold, il dit, ah non. Il me prend par la main, il m'emmène dans son bureau, puis il dit, bien, il y a certaines femmes qui vont rejeter leur bébé avant qu'il atteigne 18 ans. Et quand on donne des médicaments pour moduler le système immunitaire, certaines de ces femmes-là vont être capables de mener leur grossesse à terme. Moi, j'étais complètement sidérée. Je n'avais jamais entendu parler de l'effet du système immunitaire sur le système reproducteur. Et je ne pensais même pas que cette patiente-là allait bénéficier des traitements que Dr. Gold m'a mentionnés. Et puis, comme de fait, elle a accouché 9 mois plus tard avec le traitement de Dr. Gold. Donc, moi, j'ai lu vraiment tout ce que j'étais capable de lire sur le sujet. J'étais vraiment intéressée par rapport à ça. Et puis, Dr. Gold, voyant mon intérêt, disait, bien, on devrait aller présenter ce que toi, tu as appris dans tes lectures aux cliniques de fertilité, aux unités d'obstétrique pour voir s'il y a vraiment un besoin médical pour une clinique surspécialisée. Exactement ce qu'on est allé faire. Et puis justement, ça a fait effet boule de neige. Et puis nos collaborateurs, nos confrères, nos consoeurs dans d'autres institutions ont dit, bien, j'ai une patiente, j'ai 7 patientes. Et puis, comme de fait, on accumulait peut-être des dizaines de patientes par mois. Et puis, on a vraiment découvert un besoin médical non comblé pour les Québécois, Québécoises. Et puis, c'est comme ça, dans le fond, qu'on a commencé cette clinique-là. Et c'est vraiment Dr. Gold qui a inspiré ça en me donnant les outils appropriés et en me montrant ce qu'on est capable de faire à l'intérieur de l'institution par rapport à ça.
Puis, on va revenir au mentorat juste dans un instant, mais parlez-moi un petit peu plus de ce que vous faites maintenant à la clinique. Qu'est-ce que vous explorez? Qu'est-ce que vous espérez? Certains accomplissements que vous espérez.
Bien, en fait, la clinique d'immunologie de la reproduction, on a une clientèle qui est vraiment très particulière. Donc, on voit des patientes qui ont des échecs de la reproduction inexpliqués. Donc, des patientes qui ont maintes et maintes fausses couches, des patientes qui ont de l'infertilité inexpliquée pour lesquelles différents médecins n'ont jamais été capables de mettre le doigt sur le problème ou n'ont pas été capables de traiter les patients par rapport à ça. Et puis, nous, on fait l'évaluation immunologique de ces patientes-là et on donne des traitements pour changer un petit peu le système immunitaire pour voir si ça peut engendrer une naissance vivante. Donc, ce qu'on espère, on est déjà le centre de référence au Québec pour ça. Et ce qu'on espère, c'est vraiment être capable d'avoir un programme de formation, ce qu'on a déjà mis sur pied pour les résidents, les résidentes qui veulent se faire former dans ça. En fait, on est la seule clinique au Canada qui fait exactement ça. On est le seul programme de formation au Canada pour des résidents, des résidentes. Donc, on espère vraiment devenir une sommité dans le domaine.
Ça, c'est possible en revenant à toute l'idée d'avoir un mentorship, d'avoir cette possibilité-là, d'avoir du mentorat. Ça revient à ça, là, parce que vous avez eu Dr. Gold pour vous guider un petit peu puis vous inspirer là-dedans.
Mais c'est absolument crucial parce que on ne sait pas quand on est dans une situation qui va éventuellement devenir notre carrière. Donc, tu sais, le succès individuel, c'est vraiment un effort de groupe. Et puis, des fois, il faut vraiment juste rencontrer une personne clé qui va juste changer la trajectoire de la carrière ou de la vie. Et puis, pour moi, c'était Dr. Gold qui a fait ça. Et puis, il m'a vraiment... tu sais, il a reconnu que j'étais vraiment intéressée par quelque chose en particulier et il m'a donné les outils nécessaires pour pouvoir faire ce que je voulais faire dans le cadre d'un centre hospitalier. Donc, partir une clinique de surspécialité, il m'a vraiment connecté avec les personnes clés pour faire ça. Il m'a donné les outils nécessaires pour aller me faire former, pour partir un programme de recherche, pour vraiment mettre mon nom et le nom de l'Hôpital général de Montréal sur la map de la reproduction. Donc, c'est vraiment avec le mentorat de Dr. Gold qui a fait en sorte que moi, comme individu, je pouvais faire des changements, je pouvais avoir un impact dans le domaine de la médecine et particulièrement en immunologie de la reproduction.
Puis maintenant, c'est vraiment comme une des missions de l'Hôpital général de Montréal. C'est une des grandes cliniques innovantes. Qu'est-ce qui vous manque? Qu'est-ce que vous avez de besoin en ce moment qui pourrait vraiment vous aider à continuer à innover puis continuer à être la référence?
Du support administratif, ça serait le fun. Mais non, en fait, surtout, on veut partir un programme de recherche où est-ce que chaque patiente qui vient à la clinique, qui est évaluée par la clinique et qui doit commencer un traitement immunomodulateur, notre but, c'est vraiment de caractériser ces patientes-là et voir qu'est-ce qu'elles ont de différent qu'une femme fertile et qu'est-ce que le traitement change dans le sang, par exemple, pour expliquer justement la naissance vivante. Donc, on essaie vraiment d'expliquer les problèmes immunologiques qui mènent à la fausse couche, qui mènent à l'échec de reproduction pour pouvoir mieux traiter les patientes et mieux dépister les patientes qui pourraient avoir accès à un traitement immunomodulateur pour pas qu'elles se ramassent à 10 fausses couches avant d'avoir leur traitement.
And I mean, Dr. Gold, going back to you, it's very clear hearing you speak of Dr. Genet that you're very proud of her.
Indeed.
And you know, one of the things I mentioned off the top, you're well known for your medical discoveries, but also just for your, I think within the MUHC, for your attitude, your outlook, and for your generosity in mentorship. So what does it mean to you? What's the best part of it for you?
What we do by teaching, I guess, which has also always been the basis. There are three parts to academic medicine. There's patient care, research, and teaching. You look after patients one at a time. You do research taking a shot in the dark. But teaching, you know you're going to get the people. And I've always said, you know, the eyes have it, not AYE, but the EYE. Watch the eyes of your students. If they light up, you've got them. If not, you're in trouble. But at the end of the day, that's what we're here for. To make certain that the next generation of physicians is well educated, knowledgeable, committed to a life of learning. You can't give it up. And within the hospital environment, teaching goes on a regular basis. For example, yesterday at Grand Rounds, Dr. Feldman gave a lecture on what she's doing now in surgery, so we know. And we can prepare to do that with her. But at the end of the day, that's what makes academic medicine what it should be, always going forward. And it's going to change from time to time until, in ways that we can't even imagine now. Mm-hmm. When I first saw with Dr. Feldman's colleague, predecessor in surgery, laparoscopic surgery, I said, don't be ridiculous. Can't do that. Yes, he can. Yes, they can. So laparoscopic surgery is now is a routine phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of thing that you can do in an academic setting. You can't do that anywhere else. And the Montreal General Hospital, McGill University Health Center, has been in the focus of that from forever.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Feldman, I wanted to move back to you to talk a little bit more about where we're going in the future of surgery. You know, we're talking about laparoscopies, and I mean, what do you hope to see in a few years' time? What do you think the surgery will look like for patients? What's the experience going to be like as we continue to innovate?
Well, we're really in a period of really rapid transformation. I mean, in medicine, in surgery, in the world. And I think some of the processes that Dr. Gold mentioned, which is this revolution in making surgery less invasive that started really in the beginning of the 1990s. So increasing that also, it's not just the size of the incisions, but it's the precision. So increasing really how personalized we can make an intervention, increasingly less invasive. That means better recovery for patients. That means safer surgery, less downtime, fewer complications. And to do that, I think the really exciting part is to marry those advances in imaging and these kind of technologies like robotic surgery, where we even have more dexterity, with what's happening in being able to collect data. Like we see all over the world, you know, we see that in our everyday life as well. So just as our Waze or our Google gets us where we need to go really quickly using big data sets and even artificial intelligence, we are seeing the potential for how we will be able to apply those advanced analytic techniques and using all the information we have to continue down that road of making surgery even less invasive and safer.
And what might that look like for a patient who might be watching us, someone who might be about to undergo surgery, and how will it be different in a few years' time and make their experience different?
Well, I think first of all, just how they're going to prepare for surgery, what they're going to know about their operation, and what we know about using exercise, nutrition, all that stuff. How we as surgeons will prepare for more complex surgery. So taking imaging, CT scans, and really being able to create 3D models, using, even if we're going to look at really looking at the future, even in virtual environments, of how we can manipulate those virtual environments, almost rehearse for more complex surgery based on a patient's actual anatomy from their scans. So you can see how that could increasingly make surgery even safer. Mm-hmm. Bringing really advanced imaging, which we do already, but even more to a greater extent into the operating room, so that we marry those advanced techniques, robotic techniques, with all of those imaging techniques, so we can start to see through tissue. Mm-hmm. So those are all really exciting. And then the idea of, so what artificial intelligence can do is sort of predict things. So even better predict who's going to benefit from which intervention, which kind of implant to use, exactly, that which part of an organ that can be really targeted and only remove a part you need to remove. These are all techniques and technologies that are moving really quickly, but clearly we're on that trajectory of these improvements that are continuing, starting from minimally invasive surgery, but bringing in those other technologies as well.
And what do you need to make that happen successfully? I mean,
Yeah.
You said it's moving so rapidly. I imagine you have to be sort of opening your doors to engineers,
Right.
to computer scientists, to people
Exactly.
beyond the hospital. But also, what do you need in order to stay a very competitive and innovative teaching hospital?
Right. So it's really bringing the best techniques to our patients and being on top of not only being able to take what's already developed, but developing it ourselves. As Dr. Gold said, when laparoscopic surgery was starting, we were on the forefront of that. We were able to get the equipment, teach other people, bring in people to do the research. So it's the same model. Now it's really robotics, so increasing our footprint in robotic surgery. Those are investments, equipment investments. Advanced imaging, as I mentioned, those as well. So if you can do, three-dimensional imaging in the operating room, those are investments. But at the same time, we want to create a research program around it in robotics. So bringing in those researchers, engineers, computer science, collaborating with, well, we're in a city that's known for that, in a great university, so we have a lot of advantages there. So bringing all of that brain power together. And innovation. Surgery is about discovery, but it's also about invention. So new techniques are also about looking where needs are and inventing solutions, and then not only talking about them through research, but through opportunities in innovation where that can be applied to a wider population.
And I have a couple of questions now from people who are watching us. So. I guess, what do you think is the best way as a teacher, or the best way, I guess, for Dr. Gold and for Dr. Feldman, either of you can answer this, what's the best way, in your opinion, to support your students?
Support is an interesting question. I mean, it's an interesting word. I think the important thing we can do is make certain that we transmit information. We all do it differently. And I think I mentioned to you, I tend to do it by using metaphor. And though at the end of the day, if it makes the point, that's fine. Because don't forget, our students will become our doctors. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, we're being very selfish. But in the meantime, though, they're doing extraordinarily good things. And it's changing from month to month. Not only, it used to be year to year or many years. Not anymore. It's happening quickly. And new medication, look, with the COVID phenomenon, the immunization phenomenon, the medical, the therapy, all happened within a year. Mm-hmm. Unheard of in the past. And it's polio took forever. I remember getting in line in 1955 to get my shot. Now people are saying, should we really do that? Come on. But really, if there had been social media in 50s, we would still have polio epidemic. So at the end of the day, I mean, all these things are happening more and more quickly now. Mm-hmm. And we're learning and we're not only learning how to do it, we're learning how to accept it and utilize it and pass it on to the next generation. Our job is to make sure that the next generation of physicians and surgeons are capable of doing anything that's available to them.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Feldman, I can ask you, what do you hope to pass on to your students? Is it also to train the next generation that is going to be able to think outside the box? Because I really see that as a bit of the theme here, the ability to get rid of the haystack. That really stuck in my mind, Dr. Gold, as the key.
I think it's about inspiring people to want to improve something, to see themselves, to want to be part of something that's bigger than them. And I think the students are the smartest. We're talking about medical students, residents, fellows, getting into highly competitive programs. They're amazing. So what they need is an environment that will allow them to reach their full potential and to thrive. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big part of the job, is to create those kinds of environments for people.
Mm-hmm. You need the investments too to keep attracting the very best and to maintain that environment, right?
Absolutely. So things like robotic surgery, for example, people need to learn, they need to be trained in these advanced techniques. And they came to train in minimally invasive surgery, and they need to train in the most advanced techniques to then bring them back to their communities, because they are coming from all over the world. They're seeking out those kinds of advanced opportunities that they couldn't necessarily get. And that's why they're traveling. When at the early days of the MGH, the surgeons would go to Edinburgh, or to Germany, to train and bring back those techniques. So that's the way of the world, certainly in medicine and surgery. And in order to continue to attract the best students, trainees, researchers that will inspire us and innovate and bring the best care to our patients, and to continue to maintain us as an international center. Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure, we need to be able to provide the training for the present and for the future.
Et, Dr. Genet, pour vous, l'importance de la philanthropie dans ce que vous faites en ce moment, puis comment ça va vous aider à progresser puis atteindre vos objectifs? Bien, aider les femmes, finalement, aider des familles.
Oui, c'est absolument crucial, parce que quand on pense à débuter un nouveau programme clinique, un nouveau programme de recherche, il faut quand même de l'argent pour commencer ce programme-là. Parce que dans le fond, puisqu'on n'a pas encore fait nos preuves, il n'y a aucune agence qui va nous donner de l'argent sans qu'on ait fait nos preuves. Donc, d'avoir quelqu'un qui dit, bien, voici un montant d'argent, développe ton programme, on a confiance en toi, ça fait partir des programmes, ça fait partir des carrières. Et puis, avec cet argent-là, on est capable de développer quand même des choses qui vont nous mener à encore plus de choses pour qu'on soit éventuellement indépendant en termes de financement. Donc, tu sais, la philanthropie est vraiment très importante dans le support, surtout pour les gens qui commencent leur carrière et qui doivent faire leurs preuves.
Mm-hmm. C'est quelque chose qu'on ne sait pas nécessairement aussi de l'extérieur, à quel point ça peut aider quelqu'un qui est au début puis en développement comme ça. Alors, we're pretty much out of time, but we have a few minutes reserved. Dr. Gold, you saw little glimpses of it on the screen, but we have a little bit of a surprise for you, a small tribute to outstanding achievements and outstanding careers. So I'll let you have a look.
Dr. Gold, legend of the Montreal General Hospital, legend of McGill University. His work in discovering the CEA marker for colon cancer is still used today, widely used. It's such a huge contribution to the way we take care of patients with colorectal cancer even today. But I think when I think of Dr. Gold, it's not just this amazing research discovery and contributions that Dr. Gold made. I think of a really positive, optimistic person who dedicated his life to academic medicine, teaching, research, leadership, and whose contributions helped make McGill University famous in medicine. But he continued to be extremely down-to-earth, approachable, and a great role model for what a real academic clinician can contribute.
We have been friends and colleagues for over 50 years. I know for a fact that teaching medical students or residents is one of your joys in life. And this has brought incredible gratification to you. And if you look at all the accomplishments that go behind these matters, you can see that you are really a role model to the medical community.
For the hundreds of people who are fortunate enough to be your students, your colleagues, and your friends, unfortunately, I tick all three of those boxes. Many, many thanks. And particularly for the Montreal General, it was designed and built, but the character you can't design and build. You have to add that in layers, and it's the great personalities that made the hospital what it is today. And you're right up there in the leading pack. And so many, many thanks for your multitude of contributions and I wish you a fantastic retirement.
Hi, Dr. Gold. It's Jen. I just wanted to say a little thank you for absolutely everything. You're actually the reason I came to McGill in allergy immunology, and you actually put me on the right track for reproductive immunology. I remember you accompanying me to just about every single talk I had to give on the subject and thoroughly encouraging me the entire way through. So it's, just because of you that I have taken on this career path and been successful thus far. And, I'm exceedingly grateful. And I hope that I'm going to have a long and successful career just the way you had. And again, I think of you every single day I set foot into the clinic. So thank you for everything.
Phil Gold, to this day, remains, in my opinion, the embodiment of what is good in academic medicine, sometimes almost to the point of disadvantaging oneself in order to make sure others worthy colleagues are not forgotten in promotions. Phil has remained a mentor to me in my later years and has always been a source of constant encouragement, inspiring me to strive for excellence, but perhaps most of all, always imparting a sense of team play and eternal optimism that we have needed so much over the years, perhaps even more so recently. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Evelyn, who has always been by his side, a confidant, a counselor, and a true partner. Phil, you are unique and have molded so many careers over so many years in such a wonderful fashion. I hear a rumor that you may be retiring, but then again, you're involved in so many areas, I'm not sure what that truly means, and suspect we will continue to see you active, as you have always been for the good of your patients, your colleagues, the institution, and your family.
Phil, I can't believe that you're retiring so young, but I know that you're always going to be there for us. We were recently talking about problems with allergies with the Montreal Canadiens, and they said, what am I going to do that Phil Gold isn't there to help you out? And I said, I'm sure he'll help me out and he'll find someone that will replace him. But I know that you and Evelyn have earned your retirement, and I wish you nothing more than health and happiness, the two most important goals in life. All the best, Phil.
Phil, you're a visionary leader. You've made exceptional scientific contributions to immunology, cancer research, but most importantly, your leadership has helped to transform the Montreal General Hospital and McGill University. We would not be who we are today without you. Thank you very, very much for everything you've done, and congratulations on an extraordinary career.
I think at this point I cry. Thank you for this. All of you. All of you. My God.
I feel like it really embodied the talk that we just had, how people think of you. And I mean, you're still, in all fairness, so I believe you retired last summer from the MUHC, but you're still very much active at the MGH and still active with McGill, sort of passing down your knowledge, supporting your student, and what a great gift that is.
Wherever I can.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for taking the time. It was wonderful just watching you watch the video.
I wasn't sure exactly how to react. But thank you all.
Thank you. And thank you for watching, for being with us and taking the time yourselves. And if you want to play a part in continuing to support this great teaching hospital, these great institutions, you can make a donation to the Montreal General Hospital Foundation through codelife.ca. Go visit the website. And for more on the hospital's extraordinary history and how it's tied to the history of Montreal, you can visit the beautiful virtual exhibition at mgh200.com. And we will be back in January, taking a little break over the holidays, but back for the 4th installment of the Code Life interviews. I will see you then. Thanks again.